The date is March 8, 1942. In a conference room deep inside Imperial Japanese headquarters in Tokyo, a group of generals are staring at a massive map of the South Pacific. Red flags mark their conquests. Singapore has fallen. The Dutch East Indies is collapsing. Burma is being overrun. In less than 100 days, Japan has conquered an empire stretching from the Indian Ocean to the mid-Pacific. Now there is only one question on the table. Australia. On paper, it looks absurdly vulnerable. A nation of just 7 million people spread across a landmass the size of the continental United States. Its best troops, the experienced 6th, 7th, and 9th Divisions, are fighting Rommel in North Africa, 8,000 miles away from home. What remains? Militia units, undertrained volunteers, boys who have never fired a rifle in combat. Japanese intelligence assessments are clear. Australia is a resource-rich dominion with minimal industrial capacity, a place that ships wool and wheat to Britain and imports finished manufactured goods in return, a target ripe for the taking. But here is the thing, those intelligence reports completely missed. Something extraordinary has been happening in factories across Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide. Something that will fundamentally alter Japan's strategic calculus for the entire Pacific War. Because while Japanese planners are drawing invasion routes on their maps, Australian factories are producing weapons at a rate that would make even mid-sized European powers envious. By June 1942, those factories will have equipped 8 full infantry divisions with modern weapons, not militia with obsolete rifles. 8 divisions configured to fight German panzer divisions in North Africa. And at the center of this industrial miracle is a man named Essington Lewis, a mining executive, a businessman, someone who had never designed a weapon in his life. This is the story of how Australia built an arms industry from nothing, how Japanese intelligence completely missed it, and how that single failure shaped the entire Pacific War. Let us go back to 1939. When war broke out in Europe, Australia's peacetime army numbered roughly 3,000 regular soldiers. The nation possessed virtually no domestic production of artillery armored vehicles or heavy weapons. Most military equipment came from British arsenals shipped across 12,000 miles of ocean. Australia was in every meaningful sense completely dependent on Britain for its defense. Then France fell. In June 1940, German tanks rolled into Paris. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. The Royal Navy was stretched thin, protecting Atlantic convoys. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be built. And suddenly, the Australian government faced a terrifying reality. The 9,400-mile supply line from British factories to Australian ports could be severed at any moment. If Britain fell, Australia would be completely isolated, facing Japanese expansion with whatever weapons it had stockpiled, which was almost nothing. Prime Minister Robert Menzies made a decision that would change everything. He appointed Essington Lewis, the managing director of Broken Hill Proprietary Company, as Director General of Munitions. Lewis was 57 years old. He had spent his entire career in mining and steel production. He knew nothing about weapons manufacturing, but he knew how to build things. Lewis looked at the problem with the cold eyes of an industrialist. Australia had steel. Australia had coal. Australia had workers. What Australia lacked was the machinery, the blueprints, and the expertise to turn raw materials into weapons. So he would create them. His plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. Australia would not merely supplement British production. Australia would replace it entirely. Within 2 years, Australian factories would be producing everything from rifles to artillery pieces to tanks. The military establishment laughed. Senior officers pointed out that Australia had never produced a single artillery piece in its history, that the nation lacked precision manufacturing facilities, that the specialized steel alloys required for gun barrels were not available domestically, that the whole idea was, in their words, industrial fantasy. Lewis ignored them. He began by stealing talent. Engineers from British armaments firms were recruited with promises of higher salaries and escape from German bombing raids. German and Austrian refugees with manufacturing expertise were pulled from internment camps and put to work. American industrial consultants were brought in to advise on mass production techniques. Then he started building factories, not converting existing facilities, building entirely new factories from the ground up. The Lithgow Small Arms Factory in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney was expanded dramatically. New ordnance factories were constructed at Maribyrnong in Victoria, at Salisbury in South Australia, at Rockley in Queensland. Workers poured in. Many of them were women taking factory jobs for the first time as men enlisted for military service. By 1941, over 200,000 Australians were employed in munitions production. But here is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Lewis did not just want to copy British weapons. He wanted to improve them. The Owen submachine gun is the perfect example. In 1939, a 24-year-old inventor named Evelyn Owen showed up at the Lycite's Newcastle Works with a prototype automatic weapon he had designed in his backyard. The gun was crude, it was ugly. Military officials dismissed it as the work of an amateur. Owen was just a kid from Wollongong. He had no formal engineering training. He had built his prototype using parts scavenged from a bicycle and a sewing machine. But Essington Lewis saw something in the design. The Owen gun had a top-mounted magazine, which meant gravity helped feed ammunition into the chamber. It was mechanically simple with fewer parts that could jam or break. And it could be manufactured with standard machine tools available in any Australian factory. Lewis authorized production. By June 1942, Australian factories were producing over 2,000 Owen guns per month. The weapon would prove so reliable that American troops in the Pacific would trade their own submachine guns to get one. Japanese soldiers who captured Owen guns would keep them for personal use, recognizing their superiority over Japanese automatic weapons. But small arms were just the beginning. The real revelation. The thing that would fundamentally alter Japanese strategic planning was what Australia did with artillery production. In 1939, Australia possessed exactly 0 domestic artillery manufacturing capacity. Not limited capacity. 0. Every field gun, every howitzer, every anti-tank weapon came from Britain. Lewis decided to change that. He obtained blueprints for the 25-pounder gun howitzer, the standard British field piece. Then he set about producing it domestically, not under license with British parts. Complete domestic production from the gun barrel to the recoil mechanism to the ammunition. The challenges were enormous. Gun barrels required specialized steel alloys that Australia did not produce. Lewis built a new steel mill specifically to manufacture them. Recoil mechanisms required precision machining to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Lewis imported American machine tools and trained Australian workers to use them. Optical sights required specialized glass that had never been made in Australia. Lewis established a new optical glass factory. Every obstacle became an opportunity to build new industrial capacity. By mid-1942, the ordnance factory at Maribyrnong was producing 60 to 80 25-pounders per month. Let that number sink in. In less than 3 years, Australia had built an artillery manufacturing industry that was outproducing some established European arsenals. The 25-pounder had a maximum range of 13,400 yards. Compare that to the standard Japanese Type 38 75mm field gun, with an effective range of about 10,000 meters. Australian-produced artillery outranged Japanese field pieces by over 2,000 meters. That is not a minor advantage. That is the difference between shooting at an enemy who cannot shoot back. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence remained completely blind. Through early 1942, their assessments continued to categorize Australia as lightly defended and industrially dependent on external supply. The February 1942 bombing of Darwin reinforced this perception. The harbor was full of merchant ships. The defending fighters were overwhelmed. The town's anti-aircraft defenses were minimal. The raid went almost unopposed. What Japanese planners could not see from aerial reconnaissance, were the factories 2,000 miles south. The Lithgow arsenal producing 4,000 rifles weekly. The Maribyrnong facility churning out artillery pieces. The General Motors Holden plants in Melbourne working triple shifts. Strategic intelligence in 1942 relied heavily on signals intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, and agent reports. Australia's industrial heartland was too far from Japanese-occupied territory for effective aerial reconnaissance. Signals intelligence could track troop movements and naval deployments, but it could not photograph factory floors. And agent networks in Australia were virtually non-existent. British counterintelligence had rolled up most Japanese intelligence operations in the Pacific Dominions within weeks of war being declared. The result was a catastrophic intelligence blind spot. By March 1942, when Japanese Imperial Headquarters was seriously considering operations against Australia, their planning documents estimated Australian ground forces at perhaps 10 to 12 divisions of militia and undertrained volunteers, equipped with whatever obsolete weapons Britain could spare. The reality was 8 divisions fully equipped with modern weapons. Artillery that outranged Japanese guns by 2,000 meters. Fully mechanized logistics. Anti-tank weapons that could destroy any Japanese armored vehicle in service. The intelligence failure was not a matter of slightly miscounting battalions. It was fundamental strategic misunderstanding. The first concrete evidence of the miscalculation came in April 1942. Japanese forces had captured Australian prisoners during the fall of Java and the fighting in New Guinea. Intelligence officers began interrogating them, expecting to find demoralized garrison troops with obsolete rifles. Instead, they found soldiers carrying Owen submachine guns, weapons Japanese intelligence officers had never seen before, weapons that bore Australian markings, Australian serial numbers, Australian proof marks. This was not British equipment shipped across the ocean. This was domestically manufactured weaponry of a type that Japanese forces did not possess. The interrogation reports were forwarded to Tokyo. Analysts began revising their assessments, but it was already too late. In April 1942, Japanese Imperial Headquarters formally shelved plans for a direct invasion of the Australian mainland. The decision was not announced publicly. It simply disappeared from planning documents. The mathematics had become impossible. An invasion of Australia would require 10 to 12 divisions, approximately 350,000 to 400,000 men with all their equipment and supplies. The merchant shipping required for the initial landing alone would exceed 1.5 million tons. Japan's entire merchant marine totaled approximately 6 million tons already stretched supporting operations in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. Diverting 25% of available shipping to an Australian invasion would collapse the logistics supporting every other Japanese operation. And that calculation assumed the original intelligence was correct. If Australia actually possessed 8 fully equipped modern divisions with superior artillery and mechanized logistics, the invasion force would need to be even larger. The shipping requirements would be even more impossible. The casualties would be catastrophic. Japan had missed its window. In the span of 2 years, a nation with no arms industry had built one from scratch. A businessman with no military experience had created an industrial miracle. A gun designed by a kid from Wollongong had become one of the most reliable weapons of the Pacific War. The factories of Melbourne and Sydney had done what the Australian military alone could not. They had made invasion impossible. But this was only the beginning. Because while Japan had abandoned its invasion plans, it had not abandoned its strategy. If Australia could not be conquered, it would be isolated, cut off from American supply lines, strangled until its factories fell silent and its armies withered. The Coral Sea operation was already being planned. Port Moresby was the objective. Control the Coral Sea and Australia would be trapped. The question was no longer whether Japan would invade. The question was whether Australia's factories had produced enough weapons to hold the line. In Part 2, We will follow those weapons into the jungles of New Guinea. We will see what happens when Japanese veterans of Malaya and the Philippines encounter Australian soldiers armed with Owen guns and supported by 25-pounder artillery. We will witness the Battle of the Coral Sea, the turning point that saved Australia from isolation. And we will learn the answer to the question that haunted Japanese planners throughout 1942. Had they waited too long? In Part 1, we saw how Essington Lewis transformed Australia from an industrial backwater into an arms manufacturing powerhouse. We watched as factories in Melbourne and Sydney produced 8 fully equipped divisions, while Japanese intelligence remained completely blind. We learned how a submachine gun designed by a kid from Wollongong became one of the most reliable weapons of the Pacific War. But building weapons is one thing. Proving they work in combat is another. By April 1942, Japanese imperial headquarters had abandoned direct invasion plans. The mathematics were impossible. But they had not abandoned Australia. Instead, they chose a different strategy. Isolation. Cut the supply lines between Australia and the United States. Control the Coral Sea. Seize Port Moresby. Turn the South Pacific into a Japanese lake. And here is the terrifying part. It almost worked. In May 1942, a Japanese invasion fleet of over 60 warships was steaming toward Port Moresby. If they succeeded, Australia would be cut off from American reinforcement. Those 8 divisions with their modern weapons would slowly starve of fuel spare parts and reinforcements. Everything Essington Lewis had built would become irrelevant. And this is where everything became worse. Because the weapons were ready, the divisions were equipped, but the Australian military establishment still did not believe they would work. The problem was not industrial capacity anymore. The problem was institutional arrogance. Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell commanded Australian forces in New Guinea. He was a career officer, educated at Duntroon, trained in British military doctrine. He had served in the First World War. He had seen what proper armies looked like, and in his view, proper armies did not rely on weapons built by housewives in Melbourne factories. When reports reached his headquarters about the new Australian-produced equipment, Rowell was dismissive. The Owen gun was an untested design from an amateur inventor. The domestically manufactured 25-pounders had never been fired in anger. The Sentinel tanks were prototypes that had barely completed trials. Real soldiers, he believed, needed real weapons. British weapons, American weapons, weapons with proven track records. In a staff meeting in April 1942, Rowell made his position clear. I will not send my men into combat with experimental equipment. We will wait for proper supplies from Britain and America. That is final. His staff officers nodded. This was orthodox military thinking. You do not gamble with soldiers' lives on unproven technology. But there was a problem with orthodox thinking. Britain could not send supplies. The Atlantic was full of German U-boats. Every convoy that made it through was desperately needed in North Africa and the Middle East. American production was still ramping up after Pearl Harbor. The first significant American shipments would not arrive until late 1942 at the earliest. Australia had 2 choices: fight with what it had built, or wait and watch Japan tighten the noose. Essington Lewis requested a meeting with Rowell. He brought samples of the Owen gun technical specifications for the 25-pounder production figures, showing what Australian factories could deliver. Rowell barely looked at them. These are impressive numbers, Mr. Lewis. But numbers on paper do not win battles. I have commanded men in combat. I know what works and what does not. Your factory products are not ready. Lewis tried to argue. The Owen gun had passed every reliability test. The 25-pounders met British specifications exactly. The ammunition was identical to British production. Rowell cut him off. When you have led men into battle, Mr. Lewis, you may lecture me on weapons. Until then, I will make the decisions about what my soldiers carry. This meeting is over. Lewis left the meeting furious. He had built an arms industry from nothing. He had produced 8 divisions worth of equipment in 2 years. And now a general who had never seen the inside of a factory was telling him his weapons were not good enough. But Lewis was not a man who accepted defeat. He began making phone calls. Within the Australian military, there were officers who understood what Lewis had accomplished. Men who had visited the factories. Men who had tested the weapons themselves. Men who knew that waiting for British and American supplies meant waiting to die. One of those men was Brigadier Arnold Potts. Potts was different from the career officers in headquarters. He was a farmer from Western Australia who had enlisted as a private in the First World War. He had risen through the ranks on merit, not connections. He had no patience for institutional politics. More importantly, Potts had actually fired the Owen gun. During a factory inspection tour in March 1942, he had picked up a production model and emptied 3 magazines into a target range. The weapon had not jammed once. The grouping was tight. The rate of fire was devastating. This, Potts had said, is what my men need. When Lewis contacted him, Potts agreed immediately. The only way to convince Raoul, Potts said, is to prove him wrong. We need a demonstration. A real one. Under combat conditions. Lewis asked what he had in mind. Give me 1 battalion, Potts replied. Equip them entirely with Australian-produced weapons. Owen guns. Bren guns from the Lithgow factory. 25-pounders from Maribyrnong. Australian ammunition. Australian vehicles. Let me take them into the field and show what they can do. It was a gamble. If the demonstration failed, if the weapons malfunctioned, if the ammunition proved defective, it would confirm every doubt the military establishment had about domestic production. Lewis's entire industrial program would be discredited. But if it succeeded, Lewis agreed. They had 1 chance, 1 battalion, 1 opportunity to prove that Australian factories could arm Australian soldiers. The demonstration was scheduled for late May 1942. The location was a training area outside Brisbane. Observing would be General Raoul, his staff American liaison officers, and war correspondents. The entire military establishment would be watching. If they failed, everything was lost. The morning of May 23, 1942 was overcast and humid. Potts had assembled the 214th Battalion at the demonstration ground. 400 men equipped entirely with Australian-manufactured weapons. Owen submachine guns, Bren light machine guns, Lee Enfield rifles from Lithgow, mortars from the Footscray Works, and supporting them a battery of 4 25-pounders fresh from the Maribyrnong factory. General Raoul arrived at 0800 hours with his entourage. American observers set up cameras. War correspondents prepared their notebooks. Everyone was watching. The scenario was simple: a simulated assault on a fortified position. The battalion would advance under covering fire from the 25-pounders, clear a series of trenches and bunkers, and demonstrate the firepower of the new weapons under realistic conditions. Potts gave the order to begin. The 25-pounders opened fire. The first rounds landed precisely on target. Explosion after explosion tore through the dummy fortifications. The rate of fire was impressive. 5 rounds per minute per gun. 20 shells hitting the target area every 60 seconds. The artillery preparation continued for 10 minutes. 200 rounds of Australian-manufactured ammunition. Not a single misfire. Not a single dud. Then the infantry advanced. The Owen guns spoke first, short controlled bursts. The distinctive sound of 9mm rounds at 700 per minute. Soldiers moved in fire teams covering each other, advancing by bounds. The Bren gunners provided suppressive fire. The heavy bark of 303 rounds echoing across the demonstration ground. Magazine after magazine fed smoothly. No jams, no stoppages. The assault on the first trench line took 4 minutes. The soldiers cleared bunkers with grenades and Owen gunfire. They moved with confidence. The weapons worked exactly as advertised. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the Bren guns jammed. Raoul leaned forward. His staff officers exchanged glances. This was what they had expected. This was why you did not trust factory experiments. The soldier carrying the Bren did not panic. He executed the immediate action drill, cocked the weapon, cleared the chamber, reloaded, fired. The gun worked perfectly. Total stoppage time: 8 seconds. For comparison, the standard British Bren gun had an average stoppage rate of 1 per 300 rounds. The Australian manufactured version had just demonstrated the same reliability. The assault continued. 23 minutes after the first artillery round, the battalion had cleared the entire objective. Every weapon had functioned. Every piece of ammunition had fired. The 25-pounders had delivered 200 rounds with 0 malfunctions. Potts walked over to General Rowell. 400 men, Australian weapons, Australian ammunition, 23 minutes to clear a fortified position. Do you still want to wait for British supplies? Sir Rowell said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to his chief of staff. Get me production schedules for the Owen gun. I want to know how many we can have in New Guinea by July. The demonstration had worked. But Potts was right about one thing. Success in a training exercise was different from success in combat. The real test was coming. In July 1942, Japanese forces landed at Buna and Gona on the north coast of Papua New Guinea. Their objective was Port Moresby. Their route was the Kokoda Track, a narrow trail through some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. The force consisted of 13,000 battle-hardened troops from the South Seas Detachment, veterans of the Philippines and Malayan campaigns, men who had never been defeated. Standing in their way was the 39th Battalion, 400 Australians, average age 18. Most had enlisted within the previous 6 months. They had never seen combat, but they were carrying Owen guns, and they were supported by 25-pounders that had been manhandled into position along the track. The Japanese advanced, expecting easy victory. Their intelligence still classified Australian forces as poorly equipped militia. They carried Type 38 rifles, bolt-action weapons designed in 1905. Their light machine guns were effective but heavy. Their artillery support was virtually non-existent. You cannot drag field guns through jungle mountains. They did not know what was waiting for them. The first engagement came at Awala on July 23rd. A Japanese patrol of approximately 50 men walked into an ambush. Australian soldiers opened fire with Owen guns. The rate of fire was devastating. 33-round magazines emptied in seconds. The Japanese patrol was annihilated. Surviving Japanese soldiers reported encountering automatic weapons they had never seen before. Weapons that fired continuously. Weapons that did not jam in the humidity and mud. The reports were forwarded to headquarters. Intelligence officers did not know what to make of them. At Isarava in August 1942, the pattern repeated on a larger scale. 550 Australian soldiers held 1,500 Japanese troops for 4 days. The firepower differential was overwhelming. Owen guns against bolt-action rifles. Bren guns against Type 96 light machine guns. 3-inch mortars manufactured at Footscray, delivering accurate fire on Japanese assembly areas. Japanese casualties during the 4-day battle exceeded 600. Australian casualties were 140. The exchange ratio was not supposed to be possible. Undertrained militia were not supposed to inflict 4-to-1 casualties on veteran infantry. But the militia had weapons their enemies could not match. Word spread through the Japanese command structure. Something had changed. The Australians were no longer the poorly equipped colonials that intelligence had described. They had automatic weapons. They had artillery. They had ammunition in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. Japanese commanders began requesting reinforcements. They began requesting heavier weapons. They began asking questions that headquarters could not answer. Where were the Australians getting these weapons? How could a nation of 7 million people produce this much equipment? What else did they have that intelligence had missed? The questions would not be answered for months. By then, it was far too late. The Kokoda campaign ended in November 1942, with Japanese forces pushed back to the north coast. Total Japanese casualties exceeded 12,000 dead from combat disease and starvation. Australian casualties were 2,600. The weapons from Melbourne had done exactly what Essington Lewis promised. They had held the line, but the real war was just beginning. Because as word of Australian manufacturing capacity filtered back to Tokyo, Japanese imperial headquarters began to understand the scale of their intelligence failure. Australia was not a vulnerable dominion waiting to be isolated. Australia was an industrial fortress, and it was growing stronger every month. By late 1942, Japanese planners faced a terrifying calculation. Those 8 divisions that had surprised them in March were now 12 divisions. The artillery production that had seemed impossible was accelerating. 1,500 25-pounders by the end of 1942, 3,000 by mid-1943. The Owen gun factories were producing 3,000 units monthly. A new weapon, the Sentinel tank, was entering mass production. Japan had not merely missed a window of opportunity. Japan had created an enemy that would only become more powerful with time. In Part 3, we will follow the Australian industrial machine as it shifts from defense to offense. We will see Australian-equipped divisions push north through New Guinea supported by artillery and armor that Japanese forces cannot match. We will watch as Japanese commanders struggle to understand how they lost the production war before they even knew it was being fought. And we will witness the moment when Tokyo finally realized the truth. They had underestimated Australia, and that mistake would cost them the Pacific. In Part 1, we watched Essington Lewis build an arms industry from nothing. Australian factories produced 8 divisions worth of modern weapons while Japanese intelligence remained completely blind. In Part 2, we saw those weapons prove themselves. The Owen gun. The 25-pounder. Australian-manufactured ammunition that never failed. At Kokoda, 400 teenagers with factory-fresh weapons held 13,000 Japanese veterans. The demonstration was over. The killing had begun. By November 1942, Japanese forces had been pushed back from the Kokoda track. 12,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. Australian casualties were 2,600. The exchange ratio was nearly 5-1. But here is what Japanese commanders could not understand. Australian firepower was not decreasing as the campaign continued. It was increasing. Every month more Owen guns arrived from Melbourne, more 25-pounders from Maribyrnong, more ammunition from Footscray. The Australian army was getting stronger while Japanese forces were getting weaker. In Tokyo, intelligence officers were finally asking the right questions, and the answers terrified them. This was no longer an experiment. This was industrial war. The first comprehensive Japanese intelligence assessment of Australian manufacturing capacity arrived at Imperial headquarters in December 1942. It had taken 9 months to compile. 9 months of interrogating prisoners. 9 months of analyzing captured equipment. 9 months of intercepting radio traffic and decoding production schedules. The conclusions were devastating. Australian factories were producing approximately 4,000 rifles per week, 2,000 Owen submachine guns per month, 60 to 80 25-pounder artillery pieces monthly, over 100,000 rounds of artillery ammunition every 30 days. These numbers exceeded what Japanese intelligence had estimated for the entire British contribution to Australian defense. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 8th Area Army, read the report in silence. Then he asked a single question. How did we miss this? No one had an answer. The implications were clear. Every calculation Japan had made about the Pacific War was wrong. Australia was not a vulnerable dominion waiting for British protection. Australia was an industrial power producing weapons at rates that rivaled medium-sized European nations. And unlike European nations, Australia was not being bombed. German factories were under constant Allied air attack. Japanese factories would soon face the same fate. But Melbourne and Sydney were beyond the range of any Japanese aircraft. Australian production would continue uninterrupted for the entire war. Imamura ordered an immediate reassessment of defensive positions throughout New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The offensive strategy was dead. Japan would now fight to hold what it had. But even defensive calculations were problematic. Japanese forces in the Pacific were spread across thousands of islands. Each garrison required supply, food, ammunition, medical equipment, replacement weapons. Every ton of supplies had to travel by ship through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Australian forces faced no such constraints. Their supplies came from factories 500 miles away instead of 5,000. Their ammunition stockpiles were measured in millions of rounds. Their artillery batteries could fire preparatory barrages that Japanese gunners could only dream of. The mathematics were impossible. In January 1943, Japanese headquarters issued new operational guidance. Avoid pitched battles with Australian forces when possible. Preserve ammunition. Ration artillery shells. Fight defensive actions designed to slow the enemy advance rather than stop it. It was an admission of industrial defeat. But this was not the only challenge facing Australian forces. Success had created its own problems. By early 1943, Australian factories were producing weapons faster than the military could absorb them. The Owen gun was rolling off production lines at 3,000 units monthly. But there were not enough trained soldiers to carry them. The 25-pounder batteries were expanding rapidly. But there were not enough qualified artillerymen to crew them. Worse, the rapid expansion had created quality control issues. In February 1943, a batch of defective ammunition from the Footscray Works caused 3 25-pounders to suffer barrel failures during training exercises. 2 soldiers were killed. 7 were wounded. The incident made headlines. Critics who had always doubted domestic production seized on the tragedy. A parliamentary inquiry was launched. Questions were raised about oversight about rushing production, about whether Australian factories could really match British quality standards. Essington Lewis faced the inquiry personally. He did not apologize. "We have produced 3,000 artillery pieces," he told the committee. "We have manufactured over 5 million rounds of ammunition. 3 barrel failures in 2 years represents a defect rate of less than 0.1%. British arsenals would be proud of such numbers." The inquiry concluded without finding fault. But the incident had shaken confidence. Some commanders began requesting British equipment again. Some soldiers expressed preference for imported weapons over domestic production. The momentum that Lewis had built was suddenly fragile. Then came Buna. The Battle of Bunagona was not supposed to be difficult. Japanese forces on the north coast of Papua New Guinea were cut off. Their supply lines had been severed. They were starving, diseased, running low on ammunition. Intelligence estimated perhaps 2,500 defenders in improvised positions. Allied commanders expected a quick victory. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had spent months fortifying Buna. Coconut log bunkers reinforced with steel and earth. Interlocking fields of fire. Hidden machine gun positions. The defenders had been ordered to fight to the last man. The first American assault on November 19, 1942, was a disaster. GIs advanced across open ground into concentrated machine gun fire. They had no heavy weapons. They had no artillery support. They died in windrows. After 2 weeks of futile attacks, American casualties exceeded 2,000. The Japanese lines had not moved. General Douglas MacArthur was furious. He demanded results. He threatened to relieve commanders. He could not understand why American infantry could not break through improvised defenses held by starving soldiers. The answer arrived in the form of Australian artillery. On December 5, 1942, Australian 25-pounder batteries were finally maneuvered into position. It had taken weeks to move the guns through impossible terrain. Engineers had built corduroy roads through swamps. Soldiers had manhandled ammunition cases through jungle that should have been impassable. But now, the guns were ready. The bombardment began at 0700 hours. The first rounds struck the main Japanese bunker complex. Direct hits. The 25-pounders' high-explosive shells weighed 25 pounds each. They detonated with devastating force. Coconut logs splintered. Earth walls collapsed. Steel reinforcement twisted like paper. The rate of fire was relentless. 5 rounds per minute per gun. 24 guns in battery. 120 shells every 60 seconds, hitting an area the size of a football field. Japanese defenders, who had held for 2 weeks, began to die. Machine gun positions were silenced. Communication trenches were collapsed. Ammunition dumps exploded. The carefully constructed defensive network was being systematically demolished. Australian infantry waited. At 0800, the bombardment shifted. The guns elevated slightly, walking their fire deeper into the Japanese position. This was the signal. The 29th Battalion advanced. They moved in fire teams. Owen guns ready, grenades prepared. They had trained for this. They knew the terrain. They knew the enemy. The first bunker fell in 3 minutes. Australian soldiers approached from the flank, staying below the firing ports. Grenades went in first. Then Owen gun burst through the openings. Then bayonets for any survivors. Move, clear, move, clear. The rhythm was mechanical, brutal, effective. Japanese defenders tried to counterattack. They emerged from secondary positions, firing rifles and throwing grenades. Australian Bren gunners cut them down. The firepower was overwhelming. By noon, the outer defensive line had fallen. 147 Japanese dead. Australian casualties, 23. The advance continued through the afternoon. Each bunker was reduced by the same method: artillery preparation, infantry assault, Owen gun and grenade. At 1600 hours, the 29th reached the main Japanese headquarters position. This was the strongest fortification in the complex. Multiple bunkers with connecting tunnels. Over 300 defenders. Heavy machine guns covering every approach. The 25-pounders spoke again. For 30 minutes, Australian artillery pounded the position. Over 2,000 rounds. The noise was deafening. The destruction was total. When the infantry advanced, they found a charnel house. Bunkers had collapsed on their occupants. Trenches were filled with bodies. Survivors stumbled out dazed, many wounded, unable to resist. By nightfall on December 5th, the outer Buna perimeter had been breached. In a single day, Australian forces had accomplished what American infantry had failed to achieve in 2 weeks. The difference was firepower. American forces at Buna had attacked with rifles and machine guns against fortified positions. They had no artillery support. They had limited ammunition. They fought the way armies had fought in 1918. Australian forces attacked with the full weight of industrial production behind them. 24 25-pounders firing 5,000 rounds. Owen guns with unlimited ammunition. Bren guns that never jammed. Mortars delivering precise suppressive fire. This was not bravery against bravery. This was factory against foxhole. The factory won. The fall of Buna sent shockwaves through the Pacific theater. American commanders, who had dismissed Australian forces as second-rate colonial troops, suddenly wanted to know how they had done it. Where had the artillery come from? Why had Australian infantry performed so effectively when American infantry had failed? The answers changed American planning for the rest of the war. General MacArthur's headquarters began requesting Australian equipment for American units. Owen guns were issued to U.S. forces operating in jungle terrain. Australian manufactured ammunition supplemented American supplies. The 25-pounder became the preferred artillery piece for operations where mobility mattered more than maximum caliber. More importantly, MacArthur adjusted his strategic calculations. Australia was no longer just a base for American operations. Australia was an arsenal, a manufacturing center that could sustain offensive operations across the Southwest Pacific. The island-hopping campaign would be supported by Australian production every step of the way. Japanese commanders drew different lessons after Buna defensive doctrine throughout the Pacific changed. Fixed fortifications were de-emphasized. Mobile defense became the priority. If Australian artillery could demolish any bunker, then defenders should not be in bunkers when the shells arrived. But this created its own problems. Mobile defense required ammunition. It required supplies. It required reinforcement. All things that Japanese logistics could no longer provide reliably. American submarines were sinking transport ships faster than Japan could build them. Garrisons throughout the Pacific were slowly starving. The strategic situation had inverted completely. In early 1942, Japan had planned to isolate Australia and strangle its economy. By early 1943, Japan was the one being strangled. Australian factories continued their relentless production. By mid-1943, the numbers were staggering. 12 fully equipped infantry divisions, 3 armored brigades, over 3,000 artillery pieces, 15,000 military vehicles, ammunition stockpiles exceeding 20 million rounds. A nation of 7 million people had built an army capable of projecting power across the Pacific. And at the center of it all stood Essington Lewis, the mining executive who had never designed a weapon, the businessman who had been told his factory products would never work, the civilian who had faced down generals and proven them wrong. Lewis had received no medals, no public recognition. He operated in the shadows, managing production schedules and solving supply problems, while soldiers took the credit for victories his factories had made possible. But there was one more chapter to this story. Because the war was not over. Australia's industrial capacity would continue to grow through 1943 and 1944. New weapons would enter production. The Sentinel tank, the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, proximity-fused ammunition that would revolutionize anti-aircraft defense. And when the war finally ended, the world would discover just how much Australia had contributed. Not just to its own defense, to victory itself. But what happened to Essington Lewis? What happened to the factories he built? What happened to the workers? Mostly women who had manufactured millions of weapons. And what lessons did history draw from Australia's industrial miracle? The answers might surprise you. In Part 4, we will follow the Australian arsenal through the final years of the war. We will see production numbers that still seem impossible. We will learn how Australian factories supplied not just Australian forces, but American, British, and New Zealand troops across the Pacific. We will discover what happened when the guns finally fell silent. And we will answer the question that has haunted this entire story. How did Japanese intelligence miss an industrial revolution happening right under their noses? The final chapter is waiting, and it contains secrets that remain classified for decades. Let us trace the journey one more time. In 1940, a mining executive named Essington Lewis was given an impossible task. Build an arms industry from nothing. Equip an army that did not exist. Do it before Japan noticed. He succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. 8 divisions, 3,000 artillery pieces, 15,000 vehicles, 20 million rounds of ammunition. All produced in factories that had not existed 4 years earlier. All manufactured by workers who had never built weapons before. All delivered to soldiers who used them to turn back the greatest military expansion in Pacific history. At Kokoda, Australian teenagers with Owen guns held 13,000 Japanese veterans. At Boona, Australian, 25-pounders demolished fortifications that had stopped American infantry for 2 weeks. Across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, Australian manufactured weapons changed the mathematics of the Pacific War. But what happened to the man who made it all possible? This story has one final twist, and it is not the ending anyone expected. Because success sometimes comes with a price that history forgets to mention. When the war ended in August 1945, Essington Lewis was 60 years old. He had spent 5 years working 18-hour days. He had built an industrial empire. He had faced down generals, overcome skeptics, and transformed a nation of farmers and miners into an arsenal of democracy. He received no victory parade. There was no ticker tape, no cheering crowds, No presidential handshake or royal honor. While generals and admirals collected medals and wrote memoirs, Lewis quietly resigned his position as Director General of Munitions and returned to his old job at BHP. The factories he had built began closing. Within months of the Japanese surrender, the Australian government began dismantling the munitions industry. The Lithgow arsenal reduced its workforce from 8,000 to under 1,000. The Maribyrnong Ordnance Factory shut down production lines that had been running triple shifts. The Footscray Ammunition Works fell silent. The workers, mostly women, were sent home. Over 200,000 Australians had worked in munitions production during the war. By 1947, fewer than 20,000 remained. The skills they had developed, the precision manufacturing techniques, the quality control systems, all of it was dispersed and forgotten. Lewis watched it happen without protest. He understood the logic. Peacetime Australia did not need millions of artillery shells. The Owen gun had no civilian application. The 25-pounder was obsolete in an age of atomic weapons. The infrastructure he had built was designed for a war that was over. But there was something else. Lewis had made enemies during the war. Generals who resented a civilian telling them what weapons to use. Politicians who disliked his blunt manner. Rival industrialists who envied his access to government contracts. When the war ended, those enemies had long memories. No knighthood was offered. No statue was erected. No building was named in his honor. The official histories of the war mentioned his name in passing, crediting the industrial miracle to collective effort rather than individual vision. Lewis died in 1961. His obituary in the Melbourne Age was brief. It mentioned his career at BHP. It noted his wartime service. It did not explain that he had personally overseen the creation of an arms industry that had changed the course of the Pacific War. The Owen gun, the weapon that Evelyn Owen had designed in his backyard, received similar treatment. After the war, it was declared obsolete. The Australian Army adopted American and British designs instead. The last Owen guns were removed from service in 1971. Evelyn Owen himself died in 1949, aged only 33. He had struggled with alcoholism after the war, unable to find purpose in peacetime life. The royalties from his invention were minimal. He died largely forgotten in a boarding house in Melbourne. The men who had built Australia's arsenal vanished into history, but the legacy they created did not. The weapons and manufacturing techniques developed during the war would echo through decades of military history. The Owen gun's top-mounted magazine design influenced submachine gun development worldwide. The Sterling submachine gun, which served British and Commonwealth forces for 40 years, incorporated lessons learned from the Owen's reliability in jungle conditions. Modern bullpup rifle designs trace their emphasis on compactness and balance to studies of the Owen's handling characteristics. The 25-pounder remained in service longer than anyone expected. Australian-manufactured 25-pounders were used in the Korean War. They served with Indian forces in the 1965 and 1971 wars against Pakistan. Some were still operational in African conflicts through the 1980s. The guns that rolled off the Maribyrnong production line in 1942 were still killing enemies 40 years later. But the most important legacy was not mechanical, it was industrial. The techniques Lewis developed for rapid military production became templates for manufacturing worldwide. The quality control systems, the worker training programs, the supply chain management, the coordination between government and private industry. All of it was studied, documented, and replicated. When the Korean War began in 1950, American industrial planners referenced Australian wartime production as a model for rapid mobilization. When NATO established its industrial base during the Cold War, Australian manufacturing statistics were cited as evidence of what small nations could achieve under pressure. The numbers still seem impossible. Between 1940 and 1945, Australian factories produced over 1.5 million rifles and submachine guns. They manufactured 6.8 million artillery shells. They built 35,000 motor vehicles. They produced enough equipment to arm 20 divisions, more than twice what Lewis had originally promised. All from a nation of 7 million people. All from factories that had not existed when the war began. The total value of Australian munitions production exceeded 2.5 billion Australian pounds, equivalent to roughly $200 billion today. That investment created an industrial infrastructure that would support Australian manufacturing for decades, but the legacy extends beyond economics. Australian munitions production demonstrated something that military planners had doubted. A democratic nation could mobilize industry faster and more effectively than authoritarian regimes. Japan had started the war with a massive industrial advantage. By 1943, Australia alone was outproducing Japan in several categories of military equipment. The lesson was not lost on Cold War strategists. When NATO planned for potential conflict with the Soviet Union, they counted not just standing armies, but industrial potential. They calculated how quickly democratic nations could convert civilian factories to military production. They studied how free workers with proper incentives could outperform forced labor. Australia had provided the proof of concept. But the deepest lesson was not about economics or industry. It was about human nature. Consider what Essington Lewis faced in 1940. A nation that had never produced artillery was supposed to manufacture guns matching British quality within 2 years. Workers who had never seen a precision lathe were expected to machine parts to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Engineers who had designed mining equipment were asked to develop weapon systems. Every expert said it was impossible. Lewis did it anyway. Not because he knew something the experts did not. Not because he had secret knowledge or special abilities. He succeeded because he refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. This pattern repeats throughout military history. The tank was called impossible before 1916. The aircraft carrier was considered impractical before 1940. The atomic bomb was theoretical fantasy until it was not. Every major military innovation faced skeptics who explained in detail why it could never work. Sometimes the skeptics were right, but sometimes a mining executive from Australia looked at impossible and said, "Show me." The parallel to modern innovation is striking. Today, military establishments struggle with the same institutional resistance that Lewis faced. New technologies like autonomous systems, directed energy weapons, and cyber warfare capabilities face skeptics who explain why traditional approaches are superior. Defense bureaucracies resist change with the same arguments that General Rowell used against Australian-manufactured weapons. And somewhere right now, an equivalent of Evelyn Owen is probably designing something revolutionary in their garage. The question is whether modern institutions will recognize it before a crisis forces their hand. But there is one detail of this story that remained classified for decades. One twist that only emerged when Japanese military archives were open to researchers in the 1990s. Remember that catastrophic intelligence failure. The Japanese assessment in early 1942 that classified Australia as industrially dependent on Britain. It was not just wrong, it was deliberately wrong. Japanese naval intelligence had actually conducted a survey of Australian industrial capacity in 1940. They had sent agents to Melbourne and Sydney. They had photographed factories. They had collected newspaper reports about industrial expansion. They had compiled a reasonably accurate assessment of Australian manufacturing potential. That assessment was ignored. The Japanese Army and Navy were locked in bitter bureaucratic rivalry throughout the war. Navy intelligence had prepared the 1940 survey. Army intelligence was responsible for invasion planning in 1942. The Army refused to use Navy data on principle. When Army planners requested information about Australian industry, Navy intelligence offered their survey. Army intelligence rejected it as unreliable because it came from a rival service. They conducted their own assessment, instead relying on outdated information and wishful thinking. The result was the catastrophic blind spot we have discussed. But here is the truly remarkable part. The Navy survey from 1940 had predicted almost exactly what Australia would achieve. It estimated that Australian factories could equip 6 to 8 divisions with modern weapons within 2 years. It warned that Australian industrial potential was being systematically underestimated. It recommended that any operations against Australia account for significant domestic manufacturing capacity. The report was filed and forgotten, because one branch of Japanese military intelligence would not share information with another. Australia was not saved by Japanese incompetence alone. Australia was saved by Japanese bureaucracy. The same institutional blindness that made generals dismiss Essington Lewis made Japanese planners dismiss their own intelligence. The same arrogance that led military professionals to ignore civilian expertise led the Japanese army to ignore Japanese Navy analysis. In both cases, institutions failed. In Australia's case, one determined civilian overcame institutional failure. In Japan's case, no one did. That is the final lesson of this story. Not about weapons, not about factories, not about industrial production statistics. It is about the difference between institutions that can adapt and institutions that cannot. Australia's military establishment resisted change. Generals dismissed domestic production. Career officers preferred British equipment. The system pushed back against innovation at every step. But the system allowed Essington Lewis to operate. It gave him authority. It provided resources. It ultimately accepted his results. The institution bent rather than broke. Japan's institution was rigid. Army would not cooperate with Navy. Intelligence would not share with operations. Tradition would not yield to evidence. The system that had conquered half of Asia could not process information that contradicted its assumptions. Flexibility versus rigidity. Adaptation versus tradition. That is what decided the Pacific War. Not just American industrial might. Not just Allied code-breaking. Not just Japanese overextension. The capacity to recognize when you are wrong and change course. Australia recognized it was wrong about domestic production and changed course. Japan never recognized it was wrong about Australian capacity. From a mining executive with no military experience to an industrial miracle that changed the Pacific War, Essington Lewis proved that impossible is just an opinion. And because of what he built, Australian soldiers carried weapons that outperformed Japanese equipment. Allied forces received supplies from factories beyond Japanese reach. The war in the Pacific ended months earlier than it might have otherwise. How many lives did that save? The calculations are impossible to make precisely. But historians estimate that each month of shortened Pacific War saved between 50,000 and 200,000 lives, military and civilian, Allied and Japanese. If Australian industrial production shortened the war by even 2 months, and most historians believe it shortened it by more, then Essington Lewis and his factories saved more lives than most generals in history. Not with strategy, not with tactics, with lathes, furnaces, and assembly lines. If you know other stories like this, moments when one person's determination changed military history, share them in the comments below. The Second World War is full of innovations that seemed crazy until they worked. Radar, penicillin, the Mulberry Harbors, the proximity fuse. Each one faced skeptics. Each one succeeded because someone refused to accept impossible. This channel exists to tell those stories. The forgotten architects, the dismissed inventors, the civilians who changed warfare while generals watched in disbelief. Subscribe if you want to discover more. Because here is the truth that history keeps teaching us. The next revolutionary innovation is probably being developed right now, by someone without the right credentials, in a place no one is watching, facing experts who explain in patient detail why it cannot work. Just like a mining executive in Melbourne. Just like a kid from Wollongong with a gun he built from bicycle parts. Sometimes the most decisive battles are not fought with soldiers. They are fought with ideas that refuse to die.